extra second to get everything hooked up. I'm going to take attendance first, so if you're at home and you're here with me, just let me know what to hear. I noticed a few people have done that already. Just let me know if you're present. Just as a heads up to the people that are at home, if you still have a textbook, starting on Monday, there should be a bin outside of the science office for you to drop off your text. If there is no bin there, I'm not the person directly in control of the bin, so if there's no bin, you need to drop it off at the main office, but it does have to come back to me. So at some point, if you haven't returned it yet, make sure it's preferably before Quad 2, because I do have to hand them out again in Quad 2 for the next class, so I need to get them back from you. Just do attendance real quick and then we'll get started. So in general today, guys, in the first block, we're going to be spending some time talking about microbes, microorganisms. There is a note, if you look online, you'll need to open up in Cami. I think it'll take us about an hour and a bit to go through together. We're going to talk about the main classes of microorganisms, just so you know like what's out there, what exists. And maybe we'll take a look at some pictures of some stuff. It's obviously not as in-depth of a micro unit as I would like, but it's like we'll call it a brief overview of microorganisms, at least so you have a general idea about what they are and what kind of microorganisms exist. And then I am going to give the rest of the class for people to work on things. I would say that's probably the best use of our time, because my main focus at this point is to get everybody in here a credit. So there are a few people that have done everything. Congratulations, Tab. You are one of the few in the crowd. Jonah, are you done everything? Yeah. Okay, so there are definitely, Eric, are you done everything? Almost. I think you're close. So we definitely have a few people that are done everything, but I think at least half the class owes me something, and probably multiple somethings, and I really, really want everybody to get the credit. I would be so upset if people are not getting the credit at the end of this. So we're gonna put some effort into that today. We'll get assignments in. It would be an insane waste of your time if you did this course in probably the most difficult way you could possibly do a biology course and then didn't get a credit at the end. I'll be sad. So let's get you credit, and we'll work on that today. Nick, Jason, Erica, good. And who's at home? Brody, Parker, Nadia, and Anna. No one else at home? There's actually less people than normal. That's odd. Okay. If you do happen to show up late here, I'll put it in the chat too so people can see it if they show up late. But if you do show up late, just let me know that you're here. Can you guys see this on the screen? Tony, would you mind turning off just the light on this side, just so that you can actually see the screen? It's kind of hard to see. Thanks. There you go. Perfect.
Is Wikipedia a trusted site at all?
With regards to citing it,
Yeah.
Wikipedia is good as a starting point to get information from. It's not good for it to be your main source of any particular piece of information.
But it can't be a source.
It's okay in this course to use it as a source. In general, in academia, you never use it. And the reason that you never use it is because when you use a source, what you're actually saying is, I trust the editor of this source. That's what you're saying when you use it. And the editor of Wikipedia is just people. So you can't say, I trust the editor of this, because you don't know who the editor is and there's no way to know who the editor is. So that's the main problem with citing it. That's the purpose of a citation, is an indication. You are saying, I trust this editor, the person who's putting this information in here, and because you don't know who it is, you can't make that statement. So so you really probably shouldn't cite it. In this course, it's not a huge deal, right? But if you were writing a paper for any college course or any university course, you'd never cite it. You just can't say that. So it's not that it's a bad source. Often the information in there is excellent, especially for scientific stuff. Like, people don't mess about and like sabotage science articles on Wikipedia. And they're usually written by professionals, edited by professionals. But because you can't say, I know who edited this and I trust them, you just can't use it. All right. Can you guys, oh, you can't see this. Can you see this? Some days everything works perfect, and some days, get this going. Okay, here we go. A number of people are asking me for mark update. Okay, I've been working on it all week. I promise I've been working on it. The problem is every time I get some marks together and then I look, I have 25 more assignments that have come in from people. So then I'm like, okay, well, I'll just mark these 25 and then give you a mark update. And then when I'm done those, I get another 15 to 20 assignments from people. It's because everybody's handing in everything late. So it's really, really difficult for me to nail down a specific mark for people. I'll do my best, okay, guys? This weekend I have to basically have a cutoff and say, okay, this is your current mark. But I've been trying to incorporate everything people are giving me, because when I give marks, and people will say, well, I handed in 3 things since then. I'm like, well, I didn't get to them because I have to mark them and like put a line somewhere and say, well, here's the marks before this time. So I'm doing my best, okay, I promise. I'm getting so much late stuff in, though. It's really difficult. So this weekend I kind of just have to put a line down and say, this is your current mark. It's not that I'm going to stop marking. I'll keep marking all the way until November, what was it, 13th or something? The Friday at midnight. But I do have to put a line somewhere and say the mark report is as of this time. So don't be offended if I put out a mark report and you say, well, I finished 2 things or whatever. So I'm doing my best. Yes?
Like, if you finished an assignment, right, you just marked one, why don't you just turn it in for that specific person every time you finish one?
So that's a nice idea, right? But that's not how the marks get compiled, like in a computerized way. I have to add this mark to the totals of the marks and this mark to the totals of the marks. And if I add it that way and you don't have it done, it ends up being a 0 then. The software sees that as a 0, and then it skews your mark. So you look at your mark and you say, I have a 26 or whatever. No, you don't actually have a 26, but because that's what it looks like because of the software. So now you have an inaccurate mark report that upsets people, and then I get 100 emails, and then it's like too much trouble for me to constantly do that to people. So I try and incorporate as much information as possible so that happens as little as possible to people. I'm doing my best, I promise. Okay, I'll get you a mark as soon as I can, as soon as it's reasonable. Hi, Theo. Okay, today's content. Today we're going to be talking about microbes, microorganisms. Why can't I scroll down? What's happening? Microbiology, day 20, 1 day of microbes. You'll see that there is a notes package, okay? That's what you need to open up in Cami. There is a short video for you to watch afterwards. It's actually a really good video that talks about some of the uses of microbes. Talks a little bit about your microbiome, that the bacteria and fungus and stuff that live on you and inside of you, and how they are important in the functioning of your body. So they actually are integral to your body's function, which is kind of cool. It's a great video. It's only like 4 minutes long or something, so it's not super long, but I highly recommend it if you're interested in this idea of the microbiome. More recently, a lot of research, and I mean just in like the past 10-15 years, a lot of research has gone into this idea that your microbiome, the bacteria and fungus that lives on you, is a huge contributor to your health. And by changing your microbiome, what types of microorganisms live on you, you can actually have a huge impact on your health. It can change whether or not you have things like inflammatory bowel illnesses and things like that. Just based on what bacteria is growing inside of you. So, and there are treatments associated with giving people new bacteria in order to change the balance of what is growing inside of your gut in order to improve your health. So, anyway, lots of research in that area recently. So, let's get to this. Excuse me, that was a half sneeze. Okay. Where's my little pen? Can you guys see this? Yeah. let's talk about how life is organized in general, okay? In general, we organize living things into very broad categories, okay? Domains are the largest category, all right? There are 3 of them. The 3 domains are Archaea or Archaic Bacteria, Bacteria, and Eukaryota. Okay, those are the 3 broad categories of living things. And if you were to look back in Earth's evolutionary history, eventually you'd get back to a place where all 3 of these are actually one living thing. Okay, they all evolved from a single starter species. Okay, and the oldest 2 here are the 2 on the left here, the Archaic Bacteria and the Bacteria. I can't remember in this course if we ever looked at it specifically at a good tree of life, but let's find one. We'll take a quick look at a tree of life. Well, that's a pretty cool one. I like it. Maybe I'll even add this in as a page in here. We can look at that together. So if you look at this tree of life, and animals are making up an absolutely huge part of this, realistically, if you look at the number of species of animals, it's very small compared to the species of microorganisms. But I think this is based on sort of like a common understanding, which is that like we normally look at animals and so that they're making up a huge proportion of this tree of life here. But realistically, they don't make up species number-wise the largest amount. But if you look way back here, oh, really? It's low res? Okay. So what this is supposed to say down here, this is supposed to be Archaea over here. This is eukaryotes. And this is Bacteria. So these are the main branches of living things. You can see them branch off. And back earlier to that, right down here, is the origin of life. Okay, the very first organism on Earth, whatever that happened to be. And we don't have much information about that because we have no fossils of single-celled life. But based on other genetic evidence, we can tell that there are similarities between every living thing, and they probably came from a single origin at some point. Okay, so if you go way, way back, like I said, you can split these into 2 basic groups. And the first split here, a very early split, a few billion years ago, there was a split between these 3 major groups. Okay, 2 of these groups are microorganisms exclusively. Okay, so that would be Bacteria, which have one kingdom in them, and that kingdom is, you can even see it within the name here, the kingdom within Bacteria is called bacteria. So everything that we call bacteria is in that group, okay? And Archaea has its own kingdom name as well, and its kingdom is called Archaea. So within the domain Archaea, there is one kingdom, Archaea. So they're kind of, there's only one thing in the group, okay? It's still called Archaea. And then all the rest of them are called eukaryotes. So those are these, okay? And then they split up into a whole bunch of different subgroups, which we're going to talk about as well. And you can see that the eukaryotes make up a huge proportion of life here. We're talking about fungus and protists and animals and plants and all that. Those are all eukaryotes. All right, so going back to our 3 branches here, like I said, Archaic Bacteria makes one single kingdom. So I should mention what these are called over the top here. So these are the domains. So there's 3 domains: Archaic bacteria, eubacteria, Archaic bacteria, eubacteria, and eukaryotes. And Archaic bacteria have one single group, one single kingdom. So these are the kingdoms. In them. Archaic bacteria are just called Archaea. Eubacteria are called bacteria. And eukaryota have a whole bunch of groups in them. These are probably the ones that you're most familiar with. So they include protists. That one you may not be super familiar with. Fungi, which I think you probably know what a fungus is, I would assume. Maybe not. Plants. And the last one, animals. Okay, so those are the kingdoms. So that's why we say that there's 6 kingdoms, okay? So the 6 kingdoms are Archaea, bacteria, protists, fungi, plants, and animals. And the reason that they're split into these 3 domains is mostly because of when they evolved. So there was a big split at the very beginning, somewhere near the origin of life, that split into 3 different species groups, which eventually evolved into these, okay? So those are the big kingdoms. What we're going to do right now is just take a moment to look at what you would potentially find in each of these groups, and we're going to talk about all the single-celled ones in more detail. Okay, that's what we're going to do this morning. Those are the microorganisms, right? Things that have one single cell. They're usually smaller than what you can see with the naked eye. That's a microorganism. So eubacteria and Archaea, as we mentioned, are both part of those are the single cell. So every single one of these is single cell, and both of these are what are known as prokaryotes. Do you guys remember what prokaryotes are? We actually talked about this way back in cellular biology at the very beginning of the course. Anyone remember? So a prokaryote is an organism that does not have a nucleus. Okay, they don't have any membrane or bound organelles inside. The DNA is just floating around in the cytoplasm. They don't have a Golgi, they don't have mitochondria, they don't have chloroplasts, they don't have vacuoles. So they have no membrane-bound organelles. All the organelles that have a membrane around the outside, a circle around them in a picture, they don't have those. Okay, so they're very simple organisms. Prokaryotes have no membrane-bound organelles. So that goes for both of them. That goes for eubacteria and Archaea. Neither have membrane-bound organelles. So those are called prokaryotes. Not that long ago, 30 years ago, we actually classified these both as one single group. We said, oh yeah, those are the things that don't have nuclei. They're all one group. But due to DNA evidence, we figured out that they're actually not very closely related to each other at all. They look similar under a microscope, but because their DNA is so different, we actually figured out that they're totally different types of organisms, but they look similar. So now we split them into 2 separate groups, but both of those are the prokaryotes. Okay? Now there are minor differences between these two. On a DNA level, there's quite a significant difference, but from a functional perspective, eubacteria are, I think, what you guys would typically associate with being a bacteria. Things like there are pathogens, for example, that are, do you guys know what a pathogen is? No? Pathogen? Really? Pathogen is a bacteria that causes illness. So not all bacteria, not all eubacteria and bacteria are pathogens. They don't all cause illness, but all the ones that do cause illness are bacteria. So none of them are Archaea. Archaea are not pathogens. They don't cause illness in humans. should say here. Not all bacteria. Actually, instead of saying not all bacteria, I should say very few bacteria cause illness, because that's true. Most of them don't do anything. You guys have billions of bacteria living on your skin right now. Most of them are not species that cause illness in humans. So that's nice. It's pleasant. And in fact, you need them in order to maintain the pH of your skin and the health of your skin and stuff like that. And same thing with your gut. Your large intestine is full of these things. And you need them to help maintain your gut health. So, so these are potentially pathogenic, but very few technically are. For Archaea, the main distinguishing factor for Archaea is that most of them live in, what would you call them? Inhospitable environments, okay? They live in environments that kill most other organisms. So that's something cool about them that is very typical. There are some other sort of microscopic physiological differences between these two, but you don't really need to know them for this course, so I'm not going to get into them. But typically they live in, maybe very hostile is a better way to say that. And we're going to get into that a little bit later when we talk about Archaea in more detail, but we'll talk about what some of those hostile environments are. So an example of a pathogenic, or any type of bacteria, really. Can anybody think of an example of a species of bacteria? You've heard of some of these. Can't think of a single one, eh? Really? I'll give you a second. Huh. Okay, what about E. coli? You guys heard of E. coli before? Yeah? Hey. What about Streptobacillus? So this Streptobacillus causes strep throat. Does that sound familiar? You guys have heard of strep throat before? Yeah? Okay. E. coli causes food poisoning. Now, I will say that I'm putting out a lot of pathogens here. These are bacteria that cause illness, but there are so many species that don't cause illness. We tend to focus on the illness-causing ones as humans because those are the ones that we care about because they can impact us in a negative way. But there are many more non-pathogenic ones that don't cause illness. I'll give you an example of one that doesn't.
Can one be salmonella?
Oh, salmonella, sure. Oops. That's not how you spell that. Did I spell that correctly? That looks wrong. Hold on a second.
No, that's right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna double check. I think it is. Okay, good. Okay, and the salmonella, you guys probably already know that also causes food poisoning. So those are all strains of bacteria, species of bacteria. You guys probably have not heard of Rhizobium. I want to make sure I spell Rhizobium correctly here. Rhizobium. Yeah, there's a weird H in it that I always forget. There we go. Rhizobium is a bacteria. Actually, you guys probably talked about this in grade 9. Did you guys talk about the nitrogen cycle in grade 9? Going way back in like ecology? Rhizobium is that bacteria that takes nitrogen out of the air and makes it into fertilizer, basically. It takes nitrogen out of the air and makes it into something that plants can use. Nitrates and stuff. Does this sound familiar at all? No? Okay, anyway, you probably talked about it in grade 9. It's a long time ago. But Rhizobium basically makes fertilizer for plants. Let's think of another positive one here, because I don't only put pathogens. Oh, here's a good one. Lactobacillus. Anyone know what lactobacillus is used for? You may have eaten some today. No? What's that? It's used in dairy to make what? Cheese. Oh, you're close. Now, actually, there is a type of lactobacillus that is used for making cheese, but usually it's used for making yogurt. So lactobacillus is for making yogurt. Oh, I just forgot how to spell yogurt. Is it this? Why am I having so much trouble spelling today? Sorry. Is that right? Yeah, that looks right. That's not right? You guys are killing me. Is that how you spell yogurt? Oh no. I'm having such a bad day. Yogurt. No, yes it is. It looks wrong, but anyway. So those are all varieties of bacteria. They're prokaryotes, and they do not they don't have any membrane-bound organelles. Okay, the best example I can think of for Archaea. Anybody been to Yellowstone? No one's been to Yellowstone, eh? Yellowstone National Park. It's in the U.S. It's a national park. Okay, let me show you this. I misspelled that, of course. Maybe you've seen pictures of this before. So this is the Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone. It's a hot spring, and the water in the hot spring is boiling. It is 100 degrees Celsius. What's that, sorry? Some of them are. Some of them are very acidic. Not this one. This one is just very hot. But that brightly colored stuff that you see on the margins there, it's not a trick of the camera. It actually looks like that. Those are all Archaea. So that they're not bacteria, but they are prokaryotes like bacteria, but they live in boiling water, which is obviously something that most bacteria can't do. So normally when you boil water, it kills all the bacteria. But these bacteria need to be in boiling water. In fact, if the water cools off, they die. So what a weird system. But those are a type of Archaea. So I mentioned here that they live in hostile environments. We're going to talk about some more species of these in a minute, but let's just say they live in hot springs. Or some live in hot springs. Maybe I'll grab this picture and toss it in there. I'll put a little tiny version in. There. Like this little hot spring. So those are the two prokaryotes, okay? They are always single celled. There's no such thing as a multicellular prokaryote. They always live on their own. Now they live in colonies sometimes, so a bunch of bacteria might get together. We'll talk about how bacteria colonize in a little bit, but they're not multicelled organisms. They don't function together as one single organism. They can mate with each other and stuff like that. So they definitely are all single cell. Now, there are two kingdoms that have some multicelled and some single-celled. So there are, for protists, for example, there are some multicell and some single-cell protists, and the same thing for fungi. There are some single-celled fungi, like yeast, which is used to make like beer and wine and things like that. And there are other multicell fungi, like if you go outside, like button mushrooms and things like that you buy in the grocery store. Those are multiple-celled fungi. So you can find these as both. We're obviously going to focus on the single cell part. This is we're going to be talking about microbiology today. So we'll really just focus on the single cell component of this. But these come in both varieties. Some are all by themselves as a single cell, and some of them are multicelled. So protists, In terms of like their general characteristics, they typically live in water. Or maybe it's better to say in wet environments. They are all eukaryotes. So actually everything else on this list is a eukaryote. I don't know how do I, maybe do it in pink. So this and this, all these things here are eukaryotes. Sorry, I gotta close this one sec, guys. My computer is chugging. There we go, better. Much better. So all these right here are eukaryotes. Anybody remember what a eukaryote is? Okay, let me help you out. What's that? If prokaryotes have no membrane-bound organelles, then what do eukaryotes have? They're the other one.
They have a nucleus and everything like that.
Exactly. They got everything else, right? They have a nucleus. They have all the membrane-bound organelles, okay? So eukaryotes have a nucleus. And membrane-bound organelles. So really the easiest way to identify these things under the microscope is if it has a nucleus, well, it's one of these, and if it doesn't have a nucleus, it's one of these. Pretty straightforward. Okay, so protists, they typically live in wet environments. And other than that, there's really nothing that binds them together. We're going to talk about the classes of protists in a second, but they are very diverse. So some of them look like plants. Some of them do photosynthesis. Some of them zip around and have like little tails and stuff for zipping around. They don't look anything like plants. And so there's no real consistency within the protists. So really all I can say about them is that they live in wet environments. So some examples of those. Maybe you've heard of some of these before. I'll see if I can find little pictures for these. But amoeba. You guys heard of an amoeba before? Let's find a little picture of an amoeba so you can see one. This is an amoeba. The thing on the left. There we go. Oh, that's a good amoeba. That's an amoeba. So that is a single-celled organism. It's got a lot going on in there, and they're quite large. They're almost visible without a microscope. Not quite. They're just on the barrier of what you can see with the naked eye. But that's a pretty complex single-celled organism, right? Like it's got a whole bunch of stuff going on inside there. It can pull other organisms inside it and chew on them and stuff and do all kinds of stuff. So let me pop a picture of that in here. I wish there was a way to quickly shrink them. So an amoeba is an example. What's another example of a protist that you may have heard of? Paramecium. You guys heard of a paramecium before? Maybe not. I can't say that many people are just like sitting around talking about protists, so it's a little bit difficult here. Paramecium. I just want to show you what some of the variety of what they look like. So here, this right here is a paramecium. There's a perfect picture of one. So this one has little hairs around the outside called cilia, and it can use them to kind of propel itself around. So they zip around. I'll add that into my note too. And then I'll add one more in here because I'm sure you guys have heard of like algae before. Algae and kelp. There's another good example. So those are protists as well. Algae and kelp are both protists. That's a paramecium. And then let me find an example of a good plant-like example. I'll use some kelp. Kelp is a multi-cell protist. And it looks a heck of a lot like a plant. Wouldn't you say? I mean, when you look at that, you're like, oh yeah, that's a plant, right? It's not. It looks like a plant, but this is actually a protist. But it's a multi-celled protist, so there's a whole bunch of cells in this one. By the way, if you're ever looking for my final copy of these notes, when we're at all the little pictures and stuff, I always post these in the course notes folder, so you have access to them too if you want them. Okay. So there's some kelp. That is also a protist. Obviously, a lot of variety there, right? They look completely different from each other. Okay, fungi. What makes something a fungus? Well, they're all, what color was I using for writing here? Blue. Actually, do you guys know any properties of fungus? How do you know you're looking at a fungus? You can know something about a fungus. You're walking around outside and you're like, oh, that's a fungus.
Looks like a monkey.
What's that?
It's on like a tree.
Oh, okay, so they grow on other organisms. Okay, so there's one. They grow on or in other organisms. So the reason they grow on them is because they feed on them. They feed on whatever they're growing on. They eat it. So another way to say that they eat things in order to live, is that you say they are heterotrophs. A heterotroph is something that eats stuff. If you're an autotroph, it means that you make your own energy, like you do photosynthesis or something like that. But all fungi are heterotrophs. They eat stuff. So they're not like plants. 100 years ago, we used to say that fungi and plants were the same kingdom. They're the same thing, until somebody figured out that fungus doesn't actually do photosynthesis. They're completely different. So they grow on things. How else do you know that you're looking at a fungus when you're just like walking around outside? You guys have some indication. When you look at something, you go, oh, that's a fungus.
Looks like a mushroom.
Okay, has a mushroom, okay? Not all of them have mushrooms, but a very large proportion of fungi produce mushrooms, okay? So I'm just gonna say most produce mushrooms. So mushrooms are actually the sexual organ of the fungus. That's how they reproduce. They make spores in their mushroom, and then they release those spores into the air, and they land somewhere, and they make new mushrooms. Not all fungus does that, but most do. So I would say that's probably the most common thing, right? You see a mushroom, and you're like, that's a fungus. That's fair. That's how I would establish whether something was a fungus or not. So the other main thing is that they have cell walls around their cells, just like plants do. But it's made out of a very specific molecule called chitin. Spelled like that. Plants have cell walls too, right? You guys remember drawing your plant cell and putting a cell wall around it? Anybody remember what the plant cell wall is made out of? It's not chitin. It's made out of another chemical. No? So plant walls are made out of cellulose. We'll come back. We'll circle around. So an example of a fungus, you guys can probably name one. Or maybe not. You ever bought a fungus from a grocery store? Never. Never purchased a fungus. Never seen one? Okay. These are obviously not the scientific names for these, but a button mushroom is a type of fungus. I'm going to assume you've eaten one before. Maybe you haven't, but this is like the kind of mushroom you'd put on a pizza. Yeah. I'll name another one you see there. Crimini. Oh, I better spell this correctly. Hold on. I'm gonna look this one up. I think it's all I's. Crimini. Yeah. Except it's cremini. That'd be another mushroom you could buy in the grocery store. What's that? Portobello. Oh, did I spell that correctly? I'm not going to trust my spelling at all today because I'm doing a terrible job. Porto. Oh, no, that's Porto, not Porta. There we go. And then another big one. Yeast. If you enjoy bread or anything like that, you used to make bread, you used to make alcohol, all kinds of stuff for yeast. That's a single-celled fungus. Doesn't make mushrooms, obviously, because it's only one cell. Okay, so those are fungus. Those 4 groups are the ones that we're going to look at in more detail today because they are the ones that could potentially be microorganisms, and that's what we're going to focus on right here. The idea of microscopy, microorganisms. What's smaller than what you can see with the naked eye? Okay, so that would be these 4. These ones down here, the last 2 kingdoms, are only multicelled. So almost every single one of these is visible to the naked eye, with a few exceptions. So there are some multicelled organisms that only have like 5 or 6 cells, like a hydra or something like that. They live in pond water. So they are just a little bit too small to see with the naked eye. But, I mean, we're not going to worry about that too much. Okay, so there are a couple examples of animals, for example, that are microscopic, but there are not many. So most animals are multicelled and big enough that you can see them with the naked eye. Plants, well, you guys know when you're looking at a plant, probably. How do you know you're looking at one? You go outside and you're like, that's a plant. How do you, I mean, these are the macroscopic ones that you see daily. So how do you know you're looking at a plant? Okay, so they often have chlorophyll, okay? Not all of them are green, as you've probably noticed. So not every single plant is green, but most are, though. So most have chlorophyll. For photosynthesis, which we talked about in the last unit. We did a whole unit on plants, so hopefully you guys know a little bit about them. So most have chlorophyll for photosynthesis. So you can also say here that they make their own energy, right? They do photosynthesis. So another way of saying that is you can say that they are autotrophs.
Oh, speaking of the plant thing.
Hmm?
Since Qatar was talking about redoing the quizzes, could you redo them or no?
Could you redo the quizzes?
Yes.
Are you done everything?
Yeah.
You're done everything else?
Yeah.
So if you're done everything, and I've given you your mark report, and you're unhappy with it, then let's talk. Okay, then I can reset a quiz for you. Okay, I'm not gonna reset them all, but why don't you pick one to reset if you're done everything? But you gotta be done every single other thing. All right?
Yeah.
Wait till you get your mark report back. You might get it back and be like, it's not worth it for me to redo a quiz. So let me get you a mark report on the weekend first, okay? But absolutely, I will do that for you. Just stay in touch through email.
Are we getting our marks on Monday?
What's that?
Are
By Monday, yes. Yeah, I gotta give you a mark report over the
Do
weekend.
you
So.
think it'd be like late, like after school Monday, or would it be like in the morning?
As soon as I'm finished marking, the mark report will get posted for you. Okay. I want to be more specific than that, but it's going to take me all weekend. So whenever it's done, you'll get it. Okay, so they're autotrophs. Most of them have chlorophyll, which is green. Maybe I should add that at the end here. That's, I think, how a lot of people are identifying these things. Okay, what else? What's a property of plants that you just like see them outside? We did an entire unit on plants, guys. You can't think about anything about plants.
I don't know, like flowers.
Okay. Many reproduce through flowers. Now, not all of them have flowers, but many of them do. Do they walk around? Okay, so they don't move typically from their location. So another way of saying that is that they are sessile. Okay, sessile means that you are not mobile. Mobile would be the opposite of sessile. okay, or motile, that they can go to a new location. Plants can't do that. So sessile just means stationary. They do not move. I don't think you've ever seen a plant walking anywhere, so that's true of all plants. Okay, some examples of plants. You guys have got to be able to give me some examples of plants. You got to. You did. Really? Not a single one. I'm a little worried.
Wait, like kinds of plants?
Yeah.
Poison ivy?
Poison ivy. Go straight for the negative, eh?
Yeah.
Not my favorite plant, but definitely is a plant. Let me pull up my thing here. Maybe there's some people commenting here. Carnation, daisy. Oh, there's a whole bunch here.
Cactus.
Carnation, daisy, rose. So monocot and dicot are classes of plants, but they're not specific plants. So I'm not gonna mention that on here, but moss, and there's a whole bunch of different types of mosses. Mosses, ferns.
That's red algae.
That is actually a protist. You're on the right track, but it looks a lot like a plant. It's a plant-like protist, but that's a protist. Cool. And then lastly, the last kingdom of life here are animals. Obviously, I mean, these are not microscopic in general, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but how do you know you're looking at an animal?
Furry.
Furry? So that is a small subset of animals called mammals. Those are animals, you're right, but it's a very small subset of animals. So I'm not going to say that all animals have fur in general.
Is that rat a mammal?
A rat is a mammal, yeah. Pretty much anything furry that you can think of is a mammal.
A giraffe?
Those are mammals.
A lion?
Yep.
A zebra?
A walrus?
Walruses are mammals, but I don't think they have fur, but they are mammals though.
I was trying to think of
Oh, here we go. Here's some things here. So it's true that many animals have 4 legs. All vertebrates have 4 legs, but not all animals. So let me broaden this out here and just suggest to you a whole bunch of different things that maybe make you think of animals in a different way. A worm is an animal. A mosquito is an animal. A spider is an animal. Those insects are animals. So anything that you think of as an insect is also an animal. A tapeworm that could live in your gut is an animal.
Is a fruit fly an animal?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So what are some characteristics of all those things? Okay, so Brody, that's an interesting point. Brody said has a body. Having a body is a little bit difficult to classify here because I guess technically plants meet the definition of that as well. They have like a body, an organism body. They're multicellular. All of these are multicellular. Oh no, that's a good question. Do they all breathe O2? Do they all do cellular respiration? They're all heterotrophs. Let's start with that. So they all have to eat food, okay? Every animal does. There's no animal that's doing photosynthesis.
They move.
They move. There you go. So they're motile.
I got a question. Is a cow a mammal?
It is. Yeah. A cow is a perfect example of a mammal because you drink that mammal's milk.
How about
They all produce milk, but cows specifically, humans drink it, so it's like the most obvious mammal other than humans.
fox?
What's that?
Fox?
Mammal. You are naming all the mammals.
Panda?
Mammal.
What about a goose?
You know,
A goose does not have fur. It has feathers. They are aves,
A
or
bunny?
birds. That's a separate class. So mammals and birds are actually a separate class of animal, but they are animals. They're all animals.
A raccoon? Oh, what is this thing?
A raccoon is a mammal. You guys are naming all mammals.
It's like a. Looks like kind of
Think broader.
A moose.
an otter.
What's that?
Oh, a moose.
Those are all mammals. You guys are naming exclusively mammals. And that's fine, but there are just lots of living things, lots of animals that are not mammals. Mammal.
Isn't the blue whale the only mammal in the ocean?
What's that?
The blue whale is the only mammal in the ocean.
No,
Not?
no. Dolphins are mammals. Belugas are mammals. There's a whole bunch of different types of whales that are mammals.
Wait,
Yeah.
what
All
about-
whales are mammals.
Wait, is a shark a mammal or is it a fish?
Sharks are fish.
Is it goldfish?
Yeah.
Oh, wait, no.
So that is a separate class. They're vertebrates, but they're not mammals. Oh, multicellular, so that's good. So breathing O2 is related to them being heterotrophs. I'm trying to think if there's any organism that doesn't breathe oxygen that is an animal.
I thought one.
Even worms do though. Even worms do.
Noses?
Fish do too. They breathe O2, but they bring it in through their gills, through the water, but they still require O2. So I actually breathe O2 probably is probably a good one here.
Animal that can't breathe?
That doesn't breathe O2. So like doesn't need oxygen. There are some organisms, by the way, from these other groups, like for example fungi, that don't need oxygen to live. They use anaerobic means to live. Yeast is a good example. So yeast doesn't require oxygen to live.
So does that mean if like it could be like on a different planet? Because
They do require other things that you wouldn't find on another planet, but not necessarily oxygen.
I found it.
Found by.
It says international researchers have discovered the first animal that doesn't need oxygen to live.
What is it?
A Haneguya.
Okay, well, let's circle back to that. I've never heard of that before. That sounds interesting.
It's related to jellyfish and
Okay, have organs.
salmon.
Yeah, that's a good one. Now here's the question, Nadia.
Oh, this is recent.
You're right that many animals have sensory organs, but I'm gonna have to say most because there's one class of animals that breaks that, and that is sea sponges. Sea sponges do not have sensory organs, and they are still animals. So I'm gonna say most have sensory organs. Sensory organs are organs that let them, interact with the world, like eyes and ability to touch and things like that. Most animals have those things except for sea sponges. Most have nerves.
A mammal?
Most animals have nerves. Not all. So sea sponges again don't. What's that, sorry?
Is a turtle a mammal?
No, they are
Amphibian.
amphibians. Thank you. Okay, so some examples of animals. You guys have just named a bajillion of them, but I'm going to try and take a diverse group from what you've suggested. So, okay, raccoon was said about 5 times, so we'll put that one on there. But we have to think about things like mosquito.
Is this a real animal in alpaca? Isn't that like a llama?
That is also a mammal. Does mosquito have an E at the end? I feel like it does.
No.
Have a what?
An E at the end. Is it
No.
mosquito like this?
No.
No?
No, it's mosquito.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I should make that.
Does it have an E?
No.
No, it doesn't. Okay.
No, that's what
Mosquito,
Yeah, that's how you spell
Jaden, how do you spell lieutenant?
earthworm.
it. Leiutenn.
Sea sponge.
See?
What's another example of an animal? Clownfish. There we go. Nadia, all of these living things reproduce from every single kingdom. They wouldn't be alive if they didn't do that one. Clownfish. Okay, there. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good smattering of animals. So, again, if you look at these lists, you'll notice these are all big things, macroscopic things. They're multicellular. If you look at the list from these, at least some of them are going to be single-celled. So, for example, yeast is single-celled from the fungi. Amoeba, Paramecium is single-celled. All of these guys up here are single-celled organisms. So we're going to talk about those ones in more detail. Question?
I heard that like the most dangerous animal like in the world is the mosquito.
In terms of causing human death, that's probably true. Yeah.
It like takes the blood from a human and then puts it in like another one, and kills those people?
It transmits a lot of illnesses, yeah. I mean, the mosquito's not really doing the damage by itself, but
Could you get
with other organisms, yeah.
Would you get AIDS if like someone's blood that had AIDS?
Nope. Not enough viral load can be transmitted from a mosquito. So no.
I was gonna say that'd be bad.
They don't transfer that much. There needs to be a significant number of virus particles for HIV to be transmitted. It actually requires quite a few virus particles to actually transmit HIV. But so if a person can reduce their viral load enough to a low enough number in their blood, they actually become non-transmissive of HIV. But you got to get it pretty low.
What if like someone had corona and like a mosquito took its blood?
Coronavirus?
Oh yeah, I guess I wouldn't have to do it, but would it?
Well, you do have some in your blood. It's mostly, the coronavirus is mostly congregated around your mucous membranes, but you do have some in your blood. I think that would be a very, very rare mechanism of transfer. I don't think it's possible. So it's normally you need more than just a couple cells to be transferred in order for something to be transferred, even for viruses. Viruses just simply don't end up being transmitted with so few virus particles. Usually you need quite a few. So I would say it's extremely unlikely.
Well, how come the Zika virus was so bad?
Zika survives for a long time outside of the body.
So what happened to you?
So it can be transferred by mosquito. And very few virus particles are necessary in order for it to be transferred. So that's a great example of an illness that is transferred by mosquitoes. There's more than one. Malaria is another example. So malaria is transferred by mosquitoes as well. What's that, sorry? Dengue is transferred by mosquitoes. So it's not like there's no illnesses that are transferred, but oftentimes a fairly high viral load is required. HIV is an example of something that can't be transmitted by mosquitoes because it's so much viral load is required. There's 2 C's in raccoon. I knew that looked weird. Okay, thank you. Luckily, I can just fix that easily. Cool. Anyway.
I don't think there's 2 O's.
No, there's 2 O's. There's got to be 2 O's.
Is there a con?
Anyway, these are the groupings of life, okay, the kingdoms. We're going to focus on the microorganisms.
That's right.
So I'm going to talk a little bit now about bacteria here in more detail. So first of all, something important to note about bacteria is that they are used, well, they're everywhere. Basically anywhere something can be alive, there are bacteria. Your body is covered in them. Your desk is covered in them. The atmosphere is full of them. If you dig down in the earth, you can find bacteria all the way down to when you start getting to temperatures that don't support bacterial life anymore. So it basically lives everywhere. Every sphere of the earth, ocean, anywhere you go, there's bacteria everywhere. And they have a really diverse ecological role. So they are producers. In other words, they can do photosynthesis and provide energy. They can act as decomposers. They can break down dead things and return their nutrients to be cycled again. Some of them are pathogenic, so they cause illness in humans. We can use them for all kinds of things. We can use them to produce food. We can use them to make antibiotics. We can use, sounds weird, you can use bacteria to make antibiotics. You can use bacteria to make insulin, all kinds of stuff. They have a cell wall. So bacteria have a type of cell wall with something inside of the cell wall called peptidoglycan. You don't really need to know that, but that's the name of the molecule that separates out bacteria as being unique. So Archaea do not have that. Archaea don't have peptidoglycan. And they reproduce asexually exclusively. So bacteria are not having sex with each other. And then they multiply through binary fission. Okay, or binary division. So binary fission is very similar to mitosis. You guys remember mitosis from grade 10? So just like that, just like in mitosis, bacteria can multiply its DNA and then split into 2. And that's their main reproductive mechanism. But they don't do traditional sexual reproduction like many animals do. Do you guys remember what the advantage is to sexual reproduction? Why so many living things sexually reproduce? We talked about this a whole bunch in genetics at the very beginning. What does it give a population of organisms if they use sexual reproduction? It is their mechanism of reproduction, but why use that? Why not just make a copy of yourself? What's the upside? What's that? There's lots of downsides to sexual reproduction. You need to find a mate. It's energy intensive.
I don't know.
We talked about this back when we talked about what meiosis does. What does meiosis create in a population?
DNA.
What's that?
DNA.
It creates something in the DNA.
Only 2 daughter cells.
4. It makes 4 daughter cells. Ah, there you go. You got it, Brody. Diversity, okay? The whole purpose of sexual reproduction is to create diversity, right? You could have 100 kids, and you're never going to get 2 that are the same, right? And that gives strength to a species. The more diversity is, the more that they can be resistant to environmental conditions, okay? Because in the population, you're always going to have some members of your population that will be able to survive, okay? Is it really hot? There's some members of your population that can take high heat. Is it very cold? There's some members of your population that can take extreme cold because there's diversity in your population. If you don't have diversity, then you lose that ability. Okay, so it makes species less survivable when there's no diversity, which is why sexual reproduction is so common. Bacteria don't have that. They have a different way of making diversity. So what's that?
What about twins? Are they like?
So that would be one example where humans don't have diversity in their offspring. So if they're identical twins, if they're monozygotic. So then, no, not in that case, but in every other case.
But they wouldn't be exactly that.
Would they?
What's that?
Would they be like exactly?
Yeah, would they be just like
Usually, identical twins are genetically identical. Their DNA is exactly the same. Sometimes there is a mutation in the first couple divisions after you get a split of the zygote, in which case there are some small differences in their DNA, but they're usually identical. Or pretty close to identical. I mean like 1 in a billion differences in their DNA. It's very small. Yes?
What was I gonna say? Sorry, never mind.
No worries.
I forgot.
Anyway, bacteria get their differences because of random mutation. So as they are making copies of themselves, they just make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, there are small differences within the populations of bacteria, which is how they change over time. The same is true, by the way, for viruses. We're not going to get into viruses very much, but it's the reason why new viral illnesses suddenly exist, okay? And that's because of random mutation. A virus replicates, a trillion times. One of those replications just happens to make it so that it's infectious to humans. Bingo bango, now you have a new illness that can infect humans, okay? And the same thing is true for bacteria. There could be a bacterial illness that only infects dogs, and there could be a random mutation, and then now this bacterial illness can infect humans too. But it's based on just random chance. Question?
Is there a chance, is it possible to have more than just 2 twins? More?
Sure, triplets, quadruplets, quintuplets.
Isn't the most like 8? Someone has like 8.
Anytime you add one, the survivability of all of them goes down. So
you mean like the 8th one would be like the lifespan of like 3 years?
no, sorry, not the lifespan. The ability to carry the baby to term
Oh.
goes down.
How big would the stomach get?
Part of it is a space problem. So there's only so much space inside a human to hold a baby or babies, and there's only so much resources that a mother can provide to babies. But you can get octuplets, like 8 at a time. Now, when you have octuplets, if you do actually have that, it's very rare, but it is possible. It's very unlikely that all 8 will make it to term. Usually all 8 do not make it. So you end up getting a few of your octuplets that are not thriving, and then sometimes they have to be, surgically removed, or you have to prevent some of them from making it to term so that the other ones can make it to term. That's very common, but it is possible. Some people actually have octuplets. That has happened. It's very rare
How
though.
do you just have 8?
They're usually not identical
Well,
because that would mean that the zygote split into 8 at the very beginning. It's very, very unlikely. They're usually non-identical, which means separate eggs were released. They got fertilized separately and all implanted at the same time, and there was 8 of them. Outside of people getting in vitro fertilization, where they're having eggs implanted, it almost never happens. So when you guys see people having octuplets or quintuplets or even triplets, the vast majority of those are people who have had IVF, in vitro fertilization. That's the reason that they're having triplets. It's not natural triplets. They do exist, but they're very rare in nature for them to just happen. It's usually because of IVF.
So if you were like, would they be identical? If you...
No. So if they're through IVF, they're definitely not identical. That's 3 different eggs that were fertilized differently. And remember that every sperm is different and every egg is different
Yeah.
because of meiosis, right? So they're all going to be different, and then you're going to get 3 separate
Yeah.
difference of people. Yes.
So, like, people have like 8, I guess, babies, and I guess 2 of them are identical. Like each pair, like, are identical sometimes.
So you're saying that they had twins and then they had a separate set of twins
They had 8 kids. So like,
at the same time?
I think so. I have no idea, but they're all like the same. But there weren't just like a pair. Like each pair were identical. Not all of them were.
Interesting. Whoa, that's extremely rare. Wow. So like multiple eggs were released, they all became monozygotic twins, and you ended up with octuplets where each pair was a twin.
Yeah.
That, I mean, I don't think you could think of a more rare scenario than that. That is physically possible, but I mean, it's like outrageously rare for that to happen. Yes.
The kids that didn't survive, if you had like 8 kids, and the ones that didn't survive, do you bury them, or is it like the hospital
Whew.
keeps them, or
That is I don't know the answer to that question. Good job.
yeah.
What do you do? And you know what? That may vary from country to country, culture to culture. I actually don't know the answer to that question. It's very tough to lose a kid, and even unborn. So I don't have an answer for you on that one, Deb. I'm not sure.
Like you wouldn't even have names as kids, so I don't like. How would the funeral really work now?
That's more of a cultural question than a science question. I don't have an answer for you on that one. Okay, so why do we care about prokaryotes in general, bacteria? Okay, I mentioned a couple of them already. So one of them is that some of them are pathogenic, okay? Now I want to really emphasize here that very, very few of them are pathogenic. Very few, okay? Less than 1% of all bacteria are pathogens. That is, they cause illness. I better put underneath here, cause illness, so people aren't confused. So pathogen is one that causes illness in humans, or in another organism. It could be in pigs or something. That would be a pathogen too. But very few bacteria are pathogens, but we care about them the most because they kill us. So we tend to really, really focus on this. When I was a kid and I heard the word bacteria, everyone said, ew, bacteria are bad. Maybe people still do that, I don't know. But the vast, vast majority of bacteria are actually necessary for all kinds of reasons. But we really, really focus on pathogens. So I know you guys can name some. I'll name some off the top of my head as well. So E. coli we mentioned already is one, food poisoning, or E. coli and salmonella. It's got food poisoning. These are some common ones. What's the one that causes botulism? It's something botulinum. You guys ever heard of botulism before? Clostridium botulinum.
What is it?
So C botulinum. It is a type of food poisoning where you get paralysis. You get paralyzed by the food poisoning, and if you get it bad enough, it paralyzes your diaphragm so you can't breathe anymore. That's how it's fatal.
I think it's for pufferfish too.
How do you get it?
That is something slightly different. It's a similar chemical that inactivates the acetylcholine receptor. Very similar to botulism, actually. But that one is not produced by a bacteria.
Wait, how do you get that botch the food poisoning that like paralyzes you? Like what is it in?
Oh, it's just stopped working. How do you get botulism?
Yeah, what is
From eating food where botulism bacteria is grown in it. It's usually from improperly stored food, canned food that hasn't been canned properly. Because botulism tends to grow in anoxic environments, environments without oxygen. So it's usually things that are sealed in containers that aren't stored properly.
How would you just eat that canned food once? So give it to you, or you have to eat
You don't have to eat very much botulism bacteria, C. botulinum, in order to get botulism. It's actually a very small quantity.
And if you eat a lot, are you completely paralyzed?
It usually takes a couple days for you to become fully paralyzed, but But yes, botulinum toxin, which is made by this bacteria, is what they use when they do Botox injections. So you guys have probably seen in people what that does. It like paralyzes the muscles in your face, right? When you inject it into the face, and people do it so that they don't have their wrinkles show or whatever.
How does it not spread though?
Because it's a very small quantity. It does spread out a little bit in the general area before it starts breaking down.
That's why they turn it into a smell.
Yeah, and so it paralyzes the muscles in the face. But if you ingest C. botulinum, it produces a whole bunch of botulinum toxin, and it's global. So it paralyzes your whole body. So the body paralysis part is not a huge deal. It's the diaphragm paralysis that's the major problem, because if you can't breathe, then you die. So anyway,
What?
so C. botulinum causes botulism. But this I guess this has a useful use as well, which is it's for Botox. Don't know if that's really necessary for humans, but people get it. What else is caused by bacteria? I mean, there's like a bajillion bacterial illnesses. I want to add one more because they're so important for people. Let's just pick another random one here. Leprosy or anthrax. I'm trying to pick ones that people are familiar with. You guys heard of anthrax before? You haven't?
Yeah.
Really? It's used as a chemical weapon too, because anthrax bacteria causes very potent nervous system symptoms that can be fatal, and only requires a very, very small quantity of anthrax to be fatal to a human. The plague, bubonic plague. Yeah, let's do that. People know what that is. Bubonic plague is caused by what's the name of that bacteria? Yersinia pestis. You guys heard of the plague before? The Black Plague?
Yeah.
In like a medieval context. Still exists, but you can treat it with antibiotics, so it's not very serious as long as you get treatment in a relatively short order. How lucky we are to have antibiotics. Okay, decomposers. There are a ton. I maybe don't need to name specific species here, but they break down dead material and recycle the nutrients. Think how important that is in the natural environment if we didn't have those decomposers. I mean, dead stuff would just pile up, right? They're pretty much essential. Well, they are totally essential to recycling those nutrients. Producers. These are mostly aquatic bacteria, so they're mostly in water. And they produce a large percentage of the Earth's oxygen. Guys, I gotta restart this again. It's getting too slow. Well, I don't know why it does that. It's incredibly annoying. Sorry for the people at home here. I think I closed the chat. Open that up again here. Okay, so they're really important in terms of the Earth's photosynthesis. You want to reduce climate change and stuff like that. And you got to have those bacterial producers. So they do a whole bunch of photosynthesis. Nitrogen fixers. These provide fertilizer for most plants. So they provide natural fertilizer for most plants. Huge area of research in botany and in microbiology is designing bacteria that will grow on the surface of your crops, grow on the roots of your crops, and make fertilizer for you, so you don't have to put fertilizer on them. What a cool concept. If you can get bacteria to do the work for you, you don't have to put fertilizer on stuff anymore, or you have to put a lot less fertilizer on it. You have a ton in your digestive tract. We talked about this just a touch when we were talking about animal systems, but the ones in your digestive tract, they produce vitamins, and essential fats. So the bacteria in your gut, in your large intestine, are totally necessary in order for you to have proper nutrition. Those fats and vitamins that they produce are not found anywhere else in your diet. You have to take them in from the bacteria in your gut. So they're pretty essential. And we use them for all kinds of commercial purposes. This is something that you probably are not necessarily aware of. We use them to manufacture drugs. So you can program bacteria, usually E. coli, to make drugs for you. You want to make acetaminophen. You want to make all kinds of stuff. A vaccine. So you want to create all the little parts that go in a vaccine. You can program bacteria to make the vaccine for you. It's a really, really useful process. You can program them to make all kinds of stuff. So bacteria can be programmed to produce insulin, medications, all kinds of stuff. Vaccine components. They can also be used to make, we already mentioned this, yogurt. Can be used to make cheese. What else do we use bacteria in the process of producing? Lots of things. I'll leave it at that. We don't need a million examples. But if you take a look at that list, it's really not hard to see that most of the functions of bacteria are actually positive. They're absolutely necessary for life on Earth. So the pathogen, try and keep that in mind, that when we're talking about bacteria, they are not all pathogens by far. Okay, so there's a lot of useful stuff that bacteria do. Okay, let's talk about very, very basic structure of a bacteria. So when you look at a bacteria, what do they actually look like? How are they formed? Okay, so they have their DNA in the center. Remember that they don't have a nucleus. So their DNA is just, or maybe I'll write this off to the side here. DNA is just coiled up. Do you guys remember how your DNA is found? Other than in a nucleus? What's the format of it? How do you find your DNA inside your cells? Like, what does it look like? What?
Like a strand. Like a strand.
One single strand?
Not one single, but it can be a few. But,
What are those few called? You guys remember this from genetics? Wasn't that long ago. It was quite a while ago, actually. That's not true. Anybody remember chromosomes? Yeah, chromosomes, pieces of DNA. So you have chromosomes. Bacteria do not have chromosomes. So they have a single strip of DNA that is just in, I guess you could think of it as a single chromosome, but it's just one piece of DNA in the center of the bacteria. So they don't have traditional chromosomes and they don't have multiple numbers of these. So they just have one big loop in the middle, one piece of DNA. And they sometimes can have these smaller little loops of DNA around them with extra information. Those are called plasmids. So you can give a bacteria plasmids, you can manufacture them in a lab and give them some extra DNA. And if you do that, they will do whatever you tell them to do on that DNA. If you tell that bacteria to make alcohol, it will make alcohol. If you tell that bacteria, if you give it some DNA and say, make some insulin, it'll make insulin. If you give it a little piece of DNA and say make testosterone, it'll make testosterone. And that's why they're so useful for manufacturing purposes, is we can program them to do all of these kinds of things by just giving them a little piece of DNA called a plasmid. Very useful. Okay, so you got your DNA coiled up in the middle. Some have ways to move around. So some have flagella. So some have these to move. Not all, though. So only some of them have flagella. These little pili on the outside, these are for exchanging DNA with their neighbors. So bacteria, let's say you have a bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics. It can actually give that DNA, that resistance to antibiotics, to its neighbors. It can just pump a little piece of its DNA over to a neighbor so that the neighbor becomes immune to an antibiotic as well. Okay, so pili are used to exchange DNA. Not pilla. That's called bacterial conjugation. And then the last part is that most bacteria have some type of little cell wall around the outside. That's that peptidoglycan layer around the outside. For protection. They're not very complicated. So you guys have, oh my goodness, so much stuff in your cells. Mitochondria, vacuoles, Golgi bodies, ER, like you name it, right? All kinds of stuff on there operating, but bacteria don't have any of that. These little tiny things in here are ribosomes, so they still have ribosomes, which are made out of DNA or RNA. And actually, I'm not sure what this is. Sugar? Maybe some type of food particle, but that's it. That's it. It's a very, very simple organism. Questions about the shapes here? No. All right. They also come in groups. So these are words you've probably heard before and probably just didn't know what it meant. So they can come in 3 common shapes. If they come in little circles, that's called a cocci. C-O-C-C-I. Okay? Cocci is the plural. One single one is called a coccus. So one coccus, multiple cocci. Or they can come in this, I don't know what to call this, like a sausage shape. This is a bacilli or bacillus. Or they can come in this cool little spiral pattern. These are called spirilla. Okay, so we've got cocci, bacilli, and spirilla. They also come in groupings. So some bacteria like to grow in groups of 2. If they grow in groups of 2, you use the prefix diplo. Okay, so diplo means 2. Or they come in strips, okay, like a long strip. If they come in a long strip, you use the prefix strepto. So strepto just means strip. These words are from Latin, by the way, in case you're curious. Or they just come in blobs. So a blobby, just like a big group of them, is called a staphylo. So you can combine these two together into part of the name of the bacteria. So there is more than one staphylo, obviously. A whole bunch of different species can be staphylos, which is why there's usually like extensions on the name. It'll be like Lactobacillus or Staphylococci or whatever. Okay, so the Lactobacillus would be like the species name, and the second part is telling you about its shape and its format. So for example, if you've ever had strep throat is caused by a Streptobacillus. So strepto means it's a strip, and bacillus means that it has a sausage shape. Okay, so a strip of sausage shapes is a Streptobacillus. So you combine these together. If there's 2 cocci, that would be a diplococci. If there's 2 sausages together, that would be a diplobacillus. Okay, so you can combine these 2 together. The Spirilla typically don't come in groups. They're usually just off by themselves. So you don't hear about a Streptospirilla very often. They do exist, but very few of them are in groups. Most of them are just independents. That'd be called a monospirilla. And these, by the way, can come in singles as well, monobacillus and monococci. If you've ever had mono, you guys know what I'm talking about? You've got mono before, mono the bacterial illness. No one's had mono before?
I know someone's had it.
Fair, maybe you know somebody's had mono. Mono is a monococci, okay? That's why it's called mono. So these are single cocci that grow by themselves. They're not in groups. Okay, so that's just some basic stuff about bacteria. We've talked a little bit about its structure, what they're used for, and the general sort of formats that you find them in, okay, which is often incorporated into the name of the bacteria. Any questions about this stuff before we move on? So that's like the basics of bacteria, guys. I want to really, really quickly talk about Archaea. So we mentioned that Archaea are very similar to bacteria in that they are single-celled organisms and they don't have any organelles. But these ones are different in that they really, really like to live in extreme environments. So I just want to talk about some basic classes of Archaea and where their extreme environment is. They're usually classified by where they live because they tend to like these extreme environments, and they do not have peptidoglycan cell walls. So they're slightly different from bacteria in that they don't have that cell wall on the outside made of peptidoglycan. All right, Methanogens. You might be able to guess right from the name here. These are bacteria that produce, or I shouldn't call it bacteria, they're Archaea that produce methane. Now, I think you guys probably have some idea of where to find microorganisms that produce methane. They make natural gas. Where do you find those types of Archaea? What's that?
Is that like? Wait, call.
Yes, sir. Just I have no idea. Somewhere here.
So where are you pointing?
Methane.
Like in your gut.
In the belly.
Wait, are you talking about?
Exactly. So you have these in your large intestine, okay?
I thought you were talking about like. It's like fart, bro.
That's right. That's right. That is the reason why, okay? These things are producing methane in your large intestine. That's where gas comes from, guys. So that's one place where you find them. It's in the large intestine of a lot of organisms. You know, cows fart too. So they produce methane, all right? And they're also often found in swampy areas. So if you've ever been to a swamp and you've seen like bubbles of methane coming up from the swamp, like bubbles every once in a while, that's usually from Methanogens that live in the swamp. Yeah, and sometimes it smells bad, yeah. The methane itself doesn't actually have a smell, but it's the other gases that are dissolved in the methane, but it is methane related, yeah. Okay, so those are called Methanogens, and those are probably the most common because they live in you. You have Methanogens living in your gut right now. Halophiles are bacteria that live in very salty conditions. So I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but most bacteria cannot survive in salty conditions. It causes the bacteria to break, to lyse open. That's one of the reasons why you can like use a saltwater gargle if you have a sore throat. It does help kill some of the bacteria that are in your throat if you use a saltwater gargle. So usually, and it's also why we use salt to preserve things. So we put salt in recipes, for example, in bread. Bread has a lot of salt in it, and the reason that it has salt is mostly to prevent the growth of bacteria in the bread. So it protects the bread from bacterial growth. But these particular Archaea, they love living in salty conditions. You see them in things like salt flats and things like, in a salt flat, nothing lives in a salt flat except for halophiles. So there'd be the only organism that would live there. Plants can't live in salty conditions. Bacteria can't live in salty conditions. Only Archaea. Extreme thermophiles are ones that live in extremely high temperatures. There's really only 2 places where you generally find these. You find them in hot springs or on the edge of a volcano. These are areas that are not hospitable to any other type of life. So I showed you that picture of the Grand Prismatic Spring. That's a hot spring. Those would all be extreme thermophiles that live in there. They require a temperature usually of greater than 90 degrees Celsius in order to live, which is fatal for every other type of organism on Earth. But these things need that. They have to be in extreme hot water in order for them to survive. And the last one on here, psychrophiles, probably has the coolest name. Psychrophiles are archaea that live in extreme cold. So if you were to look into the ice in the Arctic or in the Antarctic, there's really not anything alive in there except for psychrophiles. So you will find archaea that like to live inside of ice, and they reproduce in lower than 0 degrees Celsius. In your freezer, there's basically no bacterial reproduction happening in your freezer. It halts all bacterial reproduction once you go below 0. The only times that you actually get stuff breaking down in your freezer is when you open the door. So you open the door, then you wash a little warm air in there, and then for a couple seconds you get some bacterial action going on in there if things thaw a little bit. But realistically, though, very, very little. That's why you can leave stuff in your freezer for like a year. You can have like a steak sitting in your freezer for a year. Other things happen to the steak, but not bacterial breakdown. But these things love to grow in sub-freezing temperatures. That's their ideal temperature. Okay, so those are archaea. So so far we've talked about bacteria and archaea. These are the prokaryotes. They have no nucleus. Other than that, archaea look exactly like bacteria. They're found in the exact same format. How much do I have left here? I'm going to talk about protists a little bit, and I'm going to talk about fungus for a little bit, and then we're done. Okay, just so you know. Protists. These are the most diverse living things, for sure. They're all different kinds of these things. Most of them are aquatic, and so you can recognize them because they like to live in wet environments. That's kind of like their shtick. They really need a lot of moisture in order to survive well. They are often producers, so very many of them do photosynthesis, so they're at the bottom of the food chain. But there are animal-like ones too that are consumers. So not only are some of them like plants, some of them are like animals. They often eat each other. So it's not like they're all the same. Still, protists eat other protists. So you can go all the way up the food chain with some protists. And they're found pretty much in any wet ecosystem. You can find these. There are a few that cause disease. So some are responsible for human illness. A perfect example of that is the protist that causes malaria. So malaria is caused by a protist that can be transferred by mosquitoes, as somebody already mentioned. So that actually transfers the protist from one person to the next. And they will move into the host cells and cause malaria. They are eukaryotes, so they do have a nucleus and a Golgi body and mitochondria and all the things that regular eukaryotes have. And some of them even have chloroplasts. So those are the ones that do photosynthesis, so they have chloroplasts. It's a really weird group because it's basically defined as not a plant, not a fungus, and not an animal. So if you're a eukaryote, you have a nucleus, but you're not a plant, you're not a fungus, and you're not an animal, you're a protist. It's everything else. That is how it's defined. So it's actually defined as everything other than plants, animals, and fungus. So a lot of stuff fits into this category. It's a very, very broad category. So we're going to talk about the three main groups of protists. Okay, they come in sort of three general types. One of them is plant-like protists. So plant-like protists have a feature of plants, which is that they do photosynthesis. Okay. So this is the main thing that establishes something as a plant-like protist. If it does photosynthesis, it's a plant-like protist. Not all of them are multicellular like plants, but some of them are. So some of them have things that look like leaves. You guys saw the kelp earlier. Kelp has a leaf. It's not really a true leaf because it doesn't have xylem and phloem in it, but it looks like a leaf. So it looks very similar to a leaf. It just doesn't function exactly like a leaf. So they do photosynthesis. Some are motile, so some can move, but some can't. So it's a little bit confusing. Some of them move around and do photosynthesis. Because they do photosynthesis and have chloroplasts, most of these are green, with a few exceptions. Somebody mentioned red algae, or red algae. Red algae is a plant-like protist, but it's red. It just has a slightly different version of that photomolecule that does photosynthesis. So instead of being chlorophyll, it has a slightly different type of molecule in it that does photosynthesis, but it's essentially the same. Okay, that's a plant-like protist. It does photosynthesis. It's green. And maybe I'll use my kelp example here again. So this is a perfect example of one. Looks a lot like a plant. I should show you an example of one that moves around but also does photosynthesis. So that would be a Euglena. So these little guys do photosynthesis, but they move, which is really weird. It's like a plant that can propel itself around. So it has a little tail and it swims towards light. So if you have a light or sunlight or whatever, it'll swim up towards the light so it can get the most light, which is a very strange thing for something to do, because typically our plants don't move around very much, but this isn't a plant. It's a plant-like protist. That one right there is called Euglena. Okay, animal-like protists. Another name for them is protozoans. The word zoo or zoa means animal-like. That's why you get the word zoo and zoology and stuff like that. So animal-like protists all are mobile or motile. They all move. And they all eat things. So another way of saying that is they're heterotrophs. Okay, they need to eat things in order to get their energy. And this would be things, maybe I'll show you an example video. I'll look for an example video of some protists battling it out, trying to eat each other and stuff. But the Paramecium is actually a perfect example of this one. It eats things, so it zips around looking for other small little things to eat. This Paramecium is a really good example of an animal-like protist. It's basically like a tiny single-celled animal. It's not an animal, but it looks like an animal. And then lastly, we got our fungi-like protists. So a fungi-like protist, you can probably imagine, it's like a fungus. These are my favorite because they create like this pulsing mass that can kind of pulse around and move around and eat stuff. It's similar to a fungus in that it eats things, except it can move around, unlike a fungus. So you can actually see, this one I definitely got to show you a video of because it's really cool. But they kind of pulsate and they move their body over top of whatever they're living on top of and eat it. So I'm not really sure what they call that type of movement. They use a pulsing movement to move around. They are heterotrophs. So the best, let me look up some dog vomit slime mold here. All the slime molds, oh, there's like this one is really cool. Check that out. So this is a fungi-like protist. Looks kind of like a fungus, except funguses don't usually have that like wispy arms around the side of them. These little wisps that can move around, like they can grow and retract, and I mean they're not moving fast, but they can very slowly kind of move around with these little branches. I'll see if I can post a video of that. Okay, so those are the three types of protists. You got ones that are like plants, they do photosynthesis. You got ones that move around and eat stuff. Those are the animal-like protists. And then you've got your ones that kind of look like a fungus, but they can kind of move around a little bit. But they're very similar to funguses or fungi. All right, so last thing. Let's talk about fungus. Okay, this is the last class of microorganisms. Now, not all fungi are microorganisms. We mentioned that. Some of them obviously aren't. You guys have eaten mushrooms before. Those are multicellular ones. But some of them are single-celled, so I'm just going to talk about them in general. So most of them are multicelled. If you were to gather up all the different types of fungus, 95% of them are multicelled, but there are some single-celled ones. In general, underneath the fungus, they grow this little network of what looks kind of like roots, right? Kind of looks like roots. Those roots underneath are called hyphae. Do I have that mentioned somewhere here? No, I don't. So these roots right here are called hyphae. Kind of looks like a root. And then when you get a whole bunch of the hyphae growing in like a big web, that all together is called a mycelium. So a mycelium is a whole bunch of hyphae growing in like a big web. That is the main body of the fungus. That's where the fungus is. So the fungus is usually below the surface of wherever you see a mushroom. When you're seeing a mushroom, what you're seeing is the sexual organ for the fungus. Basically, once it's big enough, it's going to grow a mushroom in order to spread its spores to a new location. But before that, the fungus has been growing for a long time, and it's been producing this mycelium all over underneath the surface. So you're only just seeing the very, very top part in the mushroom part. If you look at a piece of cheese and you see like some mold growing on it, you guys have probably seen this before, like a little circle of green mold or something, that green mold that you're seeing is the mushroom. You're only seeing the top of the fungus. The actual part where the fungus is growing is pretty much invisible to you, but it's growing much, much deeper below the surface of the cheese. So I love it when people just like cut the green part off, but you're only cutting the sexual organ off of the fungus. All the actual body of the fungus is growing down into the cheese, probably quite deep. So you're not really removing the actual fungus. You're just removing like the sexual organ of the fungus. It's like cutting a flower off of a plant. So you're not really removing the body of the plant. You're just removing the flower, the top. Sorry if I just grossed some people out there, but the fungus goes pretty deep. Okay, so that's the main body of the fungus is actually underneath the surface. Any questions about that? It's not a complicated structure. It grows a bunch of roots called hyphae. They weave together into a big net. And they use this, by the way, to eat what they're growing on top of. So those hyphae, they give out digestive enzymes that breaks down whatever they're growing into, and then they suck in the nutrients after the digestive enzymes have broken it down. So they eat what they're growing in. Usually that's not something that humans care about. We don't care about too much if a log is getting broken down. In fact, it's very helpful. When it's growing in you, it's less helpful. So if you've ever had athlete's foot or mucor is actually a very serious fungal infection in humans. Sometimes it requires amputation if it gets really deep into your flesh. But fungal infections on humans work exactly the same way. So the mycelium grows down into your tissues, starts breaking stuff down, makes them itchy and stuff like that. If you have something like athlete's foot, that's how that works. Okay, last thing I want to mention is how fungi actually reproduce. They have a really cool system of reproduction. I'm going to start at the mushroom because I think that's the part that's the most familiar to people. And you guys probably already know this, but mushrooms make spores. Okay, so they make tiny little 1N, going back to our genetics information here, they make little spores, and the spores are 1N. They have half of the full genetic information to make a mushroom, okay? And just like most of these eukaryotic organisms, they need 2N. They need a full complement of DNA in order to make a baby. So they'll release a whole bunch of 1N fungus, and some of the fungus that it releases is going to be what is called for fungus plus fungus. They don't have male and female, they have plus and minus, okay? But it's very similar to male and female in that some of the spores are plus spores and some of them are minus spores, okay? And these will go off and land on a piece of soil or something like that, or wherever that you're going to get some growth of the new fungus. And wherever it lands, it's going to end up growing a 1N organism. It's not a complete fungus. So it starts growing some cells off and making a mycelium, but it's only 1N. It cannot reproduce on its own. It does not have enough genetic information to make a new fungus by itself. So it'll start growing a 1N. And the negative 1N, if one lands nearby, it will also start growing some cells that are 1N. And if they meet right where they've met, they will start growing a new cell, a new type of cell, that's 2N. Okay? They actually combine their DNA where they meet. And this is where the mature mycelium starts growing and producing like an actual fungus. Okay, so it's not actually until a 1N and a 1N, a plus and a minus come together that they begin growing a 2N fungus, which can make its own mushroom and grow into a big, large fungus. If they don't actually meet, if a plus doesn't meet a minus within a certain number of new cells, they just die. So it's kind of like, if I can't think of a like example for humans. It would be like if a human male and a human female both had a baby, but it was only like a half baby. And so it couldn't become an adult unless the male baby and the female baby found each other and fused into a single 2N baby. That's what it is. And otherwise the baby, I guess, would just die after a few days, unless it found a male baby found a female baby. In human context, that sounds absolutely ridiculous, but that's how fungus do it. So they have a spore that is a 1N, that I guess you could think of as a male, but they call it minus, and then a plus, which you can think of as a female. And then if they meet somewhere in the natural environment, they're going to grow this 2N fungus, which is a fully grown one. And that's sexual reproduction. So that's going from 1N to 2N, just like humans do it, except obviously with some weird modification, okay? That's the basics of it. That's almost all of them multiply like that. There are a few that don't use this strategy. A good example of one that doesn't use this is yeast. So yeast are single celled, they can't produce mushrooms, and so they have a slightly modified version of this, but it's very similar. So they still have plus and minuses, and they have to meet in the liquid wherever the yeast is growing and produces new yeast. Okay, so in general, just to summarize here, we've talked about 4 classes, 4 kingdoms that produce microorganisms, okay? The 2 biggest ones are bacteria. Bacteria are used for all different kinds of purposes. They do not have a nucleus or any other types of organelles. They can cause illness, and we use them, they're producers, and they do nitrogen fixation. They're found in your digestive tract. They're very common. The second kingdom is Archaea. Archaea are mostly found in extreme environments. They're also prokaryotes, and they don't have nuclei. The third one are protists. There are 3 main kinds. Ones that look like animals, ones that look like plants, and ones that look like fungus. Most of them are microscopic, although there are a few of them that are macroscopic, that are multicellular. And lastly, there are fungi. Most of them are multicellular, but a few of them, like yeasts, are single-celled and are microscopic. Okay. Other than that, all the other living things are macroscopic, animals and plants. You guys, those are the ones you're the most familiar with. Any questions about anything that we've covered today? That's, by the way, the entire microbiology unit, but compressed into 2 hours. A little less than 2 hours. Obviously, we would spend more detail talking about these if we can do some experiments and stuff, but we didn't get a chance. Questions? No questions. People just want to work on their stuff.
Real school, would we have finished this like the entire unit in a week?
Maybe a week and a half is what I would probably shoot for here. There's a bunch of labs that take a little bit of time. We would have grown bacteria in culture. And then you guys would have put some antibiotics in there, some antibacterial soap and stuff, and see how it affects the bacteria that you're growing. That's the big lab that we normally do in this unit that we can't currently do. But yeah, there would be some other stuff like that kind of pads the unit out a little bit. But we talk about this stuff in a lot more detail. All right, guys, we're coming up on lunch in a minute here. If you're at home, this time now is for you to get whatever you need to get done. I have sent an email to every person, so everyone should have gotten an email letting you know what exactly you owe me in order to get this credit. Please make sure that you complete all of those things. Use it as a checklist. Everything on that list has got to be done in order for me to get you credit. And if you're done all those things, you could potentially work on some of the bonus stuff. No pressure. Okay, it's totally up to you. You can use it to boost your mark if you'd like. If you have any questions, you're not sure how to do an assignment, you need support, you want some help finding information, you need help picking a topic, something isn't working properly, you can't figure out how to hand something in, please just let me know, guys. I'm here to help you with whatever difficulty you're having. I really want people to get this credit, okay? I can't emphasize this enough. Let me know wherever you're stuck. I will help you get there. All right, but you got to tell me. This is the last day of this course, technically. So I won't see you again after this, for the people here and for the people at home. But I'm not disappearing. I'm not going to like fall off the earth, okay? Email me, contact me. I will happily get back to you. All right, so please, even though the course is technically over today, we do have those 3 review days towards the end. Don't forget to log in. At least on the first day of those 3, you'll need to go to Brightspace to do the course survey. It'll probably take you 5 minutes, okay? It's not a lengthy course survey. And that is, if you're done everything, the only thing you have to do.
When is that?
That would be the first day of those review periods, which is November the 11th.
What time would that be like?
When does it open?
Yeah.
8:20.
Wait, are we
Beginning of the day.
technically not switching until the 15th?
Switching to
Our next,
the next quadmester, that's when it starts. Yep, the following week.
yeah, but we're still gonna like be a class until then, right?
What do you mean?
Like we're still gonna be able to like do stuff as like class, right? Are we still gonna be like in the class or
This class is over today. Today is the last day of this course.
like in general, just like
That's right. In other words, this is the last like material day. Technically, those last 3 days, you are still in this course. You are in this course, and you can do work and contact me, and I'll be available all day, all 3 of those days. I'll post the Google Meet on Brightspace, but you can just click the link, come and see me, come and talk to me. I will be here the entire day, all 3 of those days. But today is the last technical day of the course. There's no new material after today,
oh,
so it is over.
I mean,
Okay, if you're gonna have a break at home, go for it.
Are you gonna still keep marking like for the last 3 days or?
All the way up until the very end, Friday at midnight, I will accept things. Next Friday at midnight.
I thought it was this Friday.
Yeah, no, next Friday.